Recording in progress. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the first PRISM seminar of the spring semester. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted to welcome Dr. Tyrel Stokes. Tyrel Stokes is a postdoc at NYU Langone and a senior data scientist at Zealous Analytics. His research interests include developing causal theory and methods, Bayesian inference, and applications in medicine and sports. Currently, he is working on developing theory and prediction models for understanding medication adherence using electronic health records data, as well as developing a principled framework for causal simulation experiments. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tyrel, if you want to share your slides, and we're just delighted to have you here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. Today, I want to talk about domain adaptation under MNAR Missingness. Just quickly talk a little bit about who I am for those that don't know. I sort of come from a couple different backgrounds. Originally was studying mostly economics and social sciences, a lot of things like econometrics and experimental or behavioral economics. And then I did my PhD at McGill, largely in math stats, working on things like causal inference theory, Bayesian inference, a lot of applications of things like sports, medicine, and medicine. And as mentioned, I'm currently a postdoc just up the street at NYU Langone, working on predictive machine learning, inferences, and applications of medicine. And then for fun, I'm also doing a lot of work in sports to give you a sense of what that looks like. A lot of high resolution spatial temporal data, big machine learning models, big Bayesian, generative and latent Bayesian models. And so these sort of three things sort of inform how I think about the problems that I work on, and maybe you'll see some of that today. So just to kind of ground us before we get into the nitty gritty of domain adaptation, I want to talk about sort of a real data set. So this is an example of an ICU data set. So it's called the EICU data set that's available publicly. To give you a sense of what that looks like, it's something like 200,000 encounters, roughly 140,000 unique patients. And the patients are coming from 4 different regions in the US. And so the two that I want to talk about the most today are going to be the southern region and the northeastern region. And largely, I'm going to be talking about them because we might expect quite a lot of differences between those regions. To give you a sense of what kind of variables are we talking about, we're talking about things like demographic information that are going to include the sort of patient characteristics, different vital sign recordings that are going to be recorded throughout the ICU stay, things like lab results that are going to be ordered, like tests that are ordered, and other sort of physiological measurements. And there's quite a lot of differences in the covariates and the patient characteristics across the region, as you might expect, looking at sort of hospital data from the Northeast and the South, for example. And that's already been sort of shown. And broadly, I'm just going to kind of like, I guess, dog ear this. Many of you have maybe heard about methods in machine learning, in particular, how do we sort of take into account the fact that there are different covariates, the covariate shift problem, which I'll introduce a little bit more formally as we go. But something that we don't talk as much about is there, similarly, we might expect differences in missingness. So just to give us a sense, this is a histogram of those two regions in terms of the missingness. So in this case, we're going to be looking at something like 57-ish different variables. And I don't think you can see my cursor, but the large blue line represents the marginal missingness in the southern region, which is something like 18%. So across all 57 variables, on average, we have something like 18% missingness. In the Northeast, for example, it's closer to 13. So just when we're talking about tens of thousands of records, it very clearly some kind of a difference and would be significant under any sort of reasonable test. But even more interestingly, if you look at the histogram itself, there's some pretty stark differences. So I want to draw your eye to the far left of this plot. You'll notice the Northeast has something like 33 or 4 different covariates where there's 0 or basically 0 missingness. whereas the southern group has fewer than 5. It's 3. And so this is unlikely to be sort of random variation, and almost certainly when we're talking about like these many hospitals and these many records, the result of systematic differences in things like policy and the way that they collect data. And so that's one of the many things that are kind of interesting about these health network sets, is that missingness is not just a function of what a doctor decides to record, or the interacting health professional, but also a result of policy. Those policies can be very systematically across different regions, and going to impact the kinds of data that we have. And you can kind of see here, even in this fairly standard set, we have the exact same variables being captured across in all of these different regions. We have quite a lot of differences. And in general, we don't really talk about how this may impact our missingness. And in fact, like there's really only one paper that has talked about how do we adjust for the fact that there is different missingness across different sort of data sets. Another way to sort of think about how different is the data, we can kind of turn this into a prediction problem. So we could say we can take our label as being 1 coming from the southern region or 0 coming from the northeast region. And what we can do is we can use all of the covariates that we have, as well as the missing indicators, to predict which of the 2 data sets does that record come from. And so this is a sort of histogram of those predictions. And what you'll see is that all of the blue data coming from the south, or the large majority of, is really clustered around 1, and that the data from the southern region really looks like it's coming from the southern region. And vice versa, the data from the northeast is predicted to be very unlikely to come from the southern region and is clustered near 0. If you're coming from a causal inference background, this might look something like a propensity score plot. And what we can kind of see here is there's quite a lot of discrimination between the two. And this is just a simple XG boost model. The covariates, like in particular, the missingness indicators for a lot of those variables that are always not missing in the Northeast, for example, those end up getting quite high weights in the missing in this prediction model. So this is telling us that there's quite a lot of information contained in this missingness, and we're highly able to sort of separate like where is our data coming from. Okay, so that's just to motivate, like, okay, there's not a lot of work being done in healthcare in particular to adjust for different missingness across different sets. And in particular, there's really only one paper that we have so far that sort of tells us how we might do it. But in healthcare data, in particular EHR data, this does seem to be potentially a large problem. Anybody that's worked with EHR data will know that there's quite a lot of missingness. And as we kind of showed here, we might expect it to be quite different across different regions. So I want to now kind of wrap this into this broader framework of domain adaptation. And I'm going to use another sort of EHR type example to explain like why we might care about this. So another one of the projects that I'm working on with my supervisor, Professor Sam Edekari, is how can we use EHR data to predict adherence to, in particular, heart failure drugs. So you leverage all of the information we have in an EHR and predict, is this person going to sort of take their heart failure medication? And the way this setup works is we have quite a large curated data set that we worked on in using the sort of NYU network of hospitals, but we also have collaborators at Columbia, for example. We have similar data across the 2 hospital regions, but in healthcare in particular, sometimes it's very difficult to join these data sets together. In particular, we only have certain analysts that are even able to access both sets of data. Joining them actually is very difficult when it comes to maintaining privacy, like sort of things about like HIPAA concerns, for example. But ultimately, we don't want to be limited to the fact that we're only able to predict if somebody is likely to adhere to their drugs just if they happen to have been in our NYU data set. So if we're going to develop some sort of a intervention in particular, we might want to make that intervention available to the patients in the Columbia data set. So we have to somehow make predictions on Columbia, but we might not be able to incorporate that data directly for training, or it might be limited in scope what we might want to do. And this sort of motivates this general domain adaptation type problem, which is we're going to have some sort of what we're going to call like a source data, which we have like sort of more free access to. Maybe it's like a larger sample, but we also have some other data set, the target data set, where we still want to make predictions. So in this particular case, the NYU data set, we're going to think of our source data, and the target data set, we're going to think of our Columbia. So how do we adapt a model from the source to also give us sort of reasonable inferences on the target? But as we kind of mentioned, there's likely to be somewhat differences between the data set. Even if they're similar, even if we're collecting the same kinds of information, it's not guaranteed that all these things are going to be the same. In particular, we might expect, because the hospitals serve different populations, there's going to be different patient characteristics. There's likely to be different covariates, but also, as our ICU example shows, there also might be very differences in things like missingness. And so that's what we really want to focus on today, is how can we adapt the model, particularly taking into account that the missingness might be different across these two populations. So I just want to kind of make a couple extra assumptions and make it kind of clear the particular case of domain adaptation that we're talking about. And these are simplified assumptions, and they're made basically just so we can really focus on the missingness part of this problem. Of course, we could eventually look at relaxing some of these assumptions, but we're going to assume that we have full samples from the source. So all of the samples that exist of all of the data. So of the outcome, of R, which is going to be our sort of missingness indicator, and X, which is going to be our covariates. And then we're going to assume that we have some samples from the target. But in particular, in this case, we're actually going to assume that we don't really have any samples of the outcome, but just the sort of missingness and the covariate information. And again, we can relax some of this information later. We could talk about how we might do that, or the implications. But largely, this is just to sort of simplify the setting and focus on missingness. In addition, we're going to make one somewhat strong assumption for similar reasons, that the conditional outcome distribution in both the source and the target is the same. So of course, you can imagine in practice, this might be somewhat restrictive, but again, in order to focus on the missingness part, we're going to assume that the conditional outcome is the same. And again, we'll talk about later what that might look like to relax this. So in general, in the domain adaptation literature, there's been sort of three types of domain adaptations that have been studied. Far and away, the most studied, where there's really tons of literature, is this kind of problem I mentioned earlier, the covariate shift problem, which just says that there's some kind of difference in the marginal distribution of the covariates between the source and the target. So lots of literature. It's likely that many of you have seen versions of this problem or seen some of the solutions. The second one, much less literature, but still fairly well studied, is this concept shift. So meaning the conditional outcomes are actually different. And finally, label shift, which is we're going to assume that the marginal outcome distributions are different, but the sort of inverse covariate distributions are the same. So these are sort of three. Notice there isn't really a missingness shift on there. As we kind of mentioned, there's really one paper that is about missingness shift. And it turns out we can kind of shoehorn at least some of this into a special case of the covariate shift problem. So if we're additionally willing to make this assumption that we just made on the previous slide, that the conditional outcome distributions are the same, there are fairly well-studied solutions to this problem, or at least there are sort of recipes you can follow to sort of help adapt your model, taking into account the covariate shift. And it turns out the missingness shift problem, or at least the sort of missingness shift problem that we're going to be studying, shares a lot of characteristics with this special case, which is a good sign, because we're going to be able to steal a lot of the work that's been developed for this problem. To just give you some intuition of like what this looks like, this is completely fake data. Probably the regression lines are not correct. I know there's some like fun studies when you get people to eyeball a regression line, they tend to be wrong. I'm sure that's the case here as well. So we're going to assume the conditional, the green line, the curved line is sort of the true conditional mean that's going to be shared by both populations. We have a target, a set of target data in the, I actually can't see my right side of my screen. Blue is going to be the source data, and the red star is going to be the target. And so to think about this in the sort of machine learning framework, this is a super simple case where like the true conditional mean is just a polynomial. But to sort of replicate a realistic situation, we're going to sort of imagine we have this richer truth, and then our model lives in sort of a less rich space. So like the truth is polynomial, but our models sort of live in this like linear space. And what happens if I fit a model just on the source? Well, I get this blue line. What happens if I fit just my kind of model on the target? I get this red line. And clearly, if I just sort of assume, if I take that blue line and I try to make predictions on the target using that data, it's not going to work very well. The approximation is poor, and it's because we're living in sort of different parts of the curve. So those approximations are going to be dependent on what the covariate distribution is. And because the covariate distribution is different, we're going to get different approximations, and our predictions are going to be bad. So what do we do in this literature? Well, it turns out when we're able to make the assumption that they share the same conditional distribution, we can rewrite this problem in terms of sort of an important sampling type approach. So at top, we have the target problem. This is the domain adaptation problem. We're trying to minimize some loss function in the target space. But because I'm able to make the assumption that the conditional outcome distribution is the same, I can actually rewrite that problem in terms of a minimization in the source data. And that looks a lot like a normal loss function, but it has this new weight, which is the distribution of the target over the distribution of the source. And so what does this tell us? It gives us kind of a recipe. If I'm able to estimate these weights, all I need to do is reweight my source data according to those weights. And now I can sort of get a better approximation in the target data. So what does that look like? Well, notice the source data that's a little bit closer to the target data is going to get higher weight. And because I weight them more, my line is going to sort of shift towards that target data. And now, obviously, this is not perfect, but this new sort of source line using the weighting is clearly much closer to the approximation that we would have gotten if we'd only used the target data. So that's great. Again, this is fake data. So what does it look like with real simulated data? Again, we'll take this. We'll assume that the outcome both come from the same sort of polynomial normal distributions. We'll say that the source in this time is coming from normal 0, 1. The target is coming from 1, 1. If I just use the source data directly, I get like this sort of line going upwards. If I use the target data directly, it's going downwards. They're not even in the same direction. Like if you were looking at some sort of effect, you would get opposite effect directions. But if I weight the data and I'm basically using the source data that looks more similar to target data, I end up getting a sort of a line in between that's much closer to the target prediction that we want. So this is the sort of basic intuition, and it kind of comes down in the robust statistics literature. Anytime your model is somewhat wrong, your approximation will depend on the covariate distribution. And if the covariate distribution is different in your two populations, that means that your approximations are going to be different. And we have to sort of account for that fact if we want to make better approximations in the target. But that's great. So we have some sort of way to do better in this covariate shift problem. But what about missingness? So let's talk about missingness for a second. There's a lot of different types of missingness, and the two sort of most simple are missing completely at random and missing at random. Many of you have probably seen versions of this before. To introduce some of the notation, we were using X for our covariate distribution. I'm going to partition that into two parts. So the first part is going to be X subscript O, which I'm going to assume is our covariates, which we always observe fully. And then we also have XU, which are going to be our partially observed covariates. So sometimes these variables are missing. And I'm going to think of XU as sort of a counterfactual data. So what would the data have looked like were it to have been complete? So that's what XU is. And now XU star is going to be what we actually observe of those partially variables. And so when R is 1, we observe the counterfactual data. When R is 0, we get an NA. We don't have any data. So XU is what we wish we had observed in some sense. XU star is what we actually observe of that data. I'm going to use this opportunity, since I think probably many of you have seen these different types of missingness, to introduce like a framework for representing some of these missingness structures. So on the right, I have two graphs. These are what we're going to call MDAGs. These are a lot like your normal DAGs, but they are going to also allow us to represent missingness. So if I look at the one on the top right, most of the relationships look actually quite similar to what we're used to in a normal DAG. For example, XO causes Y, that represents some probabilistic relationship between the two. We can see Y in this context is a function of both the XU and XO that represents some sort of distribution. The thing that's different about MDAGs is that the arrow sort of involving R and the observed data. So you'll notice in this context, there's something a little bit strange about XU star. And XU star is that data that we actually observe, but it's not really a probabilistic relationship between the missingness and the counterfactual data, but rather, as I sort of defined it up top, if I know the missingness indicator and if I knew the counterfactual data, that actually completely determines what I observe. So it's not really representing a probabilistic relationship in the usual sense, but rather a deterministic relationship. And that's the sort of defining thing that makes these MDAGs slightly different than a normal DAG. And it means that some of the sort of usual results you might be used to in causal inference and like things like d-separation don't quite give us the completeness of like all of the sort of structures we can identify. So this top one on the right is a graph of what we'd call, it's an example of missing completely at random. Where do we see the missing completely at random part in the graph? Well, it's the fact that R is not caused by anything at all. And so what would it mean for us to have this type of missingness shift? It would just simply mean that we have two structures, both in the target and the source. They both have these just marginal distributions of missingness. They don't depend on any variables observed or otherwise. And they just happen to be different, like a different marginal amount of missingness in the variables, but not caused by anything. On the bottom, we have an example of missing at random data. Missing at random means that the missingness might depend on some variables, but those variables are restricted to be variables that we actually observe. And so in this case, we can see that XO causes the missingness now. What would it mean for us to have missing at random missingness shift? It just means that there's distributions, they depend on the observed variables, but the way that they depend on those variables might be different in some way. And so that's broadly, these are the two simplest types of missingness. And it turns out like basically these two problems, like I mentioned, there's been one paper that has talked a little bit about missingness shift. It turns out these cases really fit almost directly into that covariate shift framework. We can use basically the same solutions with the same kinds of guarantees. And so how does that work? Well, and in this case, let's just imagine our loss function is the mean squared error, for example. We can basically do the exact same thing. We have this minimization problem in the target that we care about. We want to use our source data. How do we rewrite the target problem in terms of the source problem? Well, it ends up looking like a normal source problem, but we have these weights that stick out in front. And the weights are pretty similar to before. But now they're a little bit more complicated. They're a function of both the missingness distributions and the covariate distributions. But if we're able to estimate these weights, we can reweight our source data like before. and we're going to be able to do better at the target minimization problem. So that's great. And what you'll notice is that this also actually means that we can take into account simultaneous missingness shift and covariate shift, as long as we're able to estimate these weights. So that's great, but like, why does it work? The thing that you might notice, or probably not until I point it out because the notation is subtle enough. Notice that these minimization problems are not a function of the counterfactual covariates, but rather a function of the what we actually observe, XU star, for example. And the reason why this approach works for these two types of missingness is basically the fact that if we're willing to assume that the conditional outcome distribution is the same in the target and the source for the counterfactual data, the data that we wish we observed had it been completed, well, if our missingness belongs to those simpler cases, it implies that the conditional outcomes are the same given the observed data. And so that basically means that we're in that same case where we're on the same curve, and now all we have to do is estimate the right weights, and we're going to sort of take our approximation and make it a little bit closer to the truth. And that's true even if the way that those two, the data is missing is slightly different. So for example, we have missing at random, and the way in which the missingness in the source depends on the data is different than the way that it depends on the data in the case that in the target, for example. So that's why it works. And now I'm going to get to the sort of most complicated type of missingness. This is missing not at random, where really we just mean that in some case, the missingness is going to depend in some sense on something that's unobserved. This is one particular example, which I think is likely to be common in healthcare data, which is the case of self-censoring, which is that the missingness itself is going to depend on the value of the thing that is missing. So one example in healthcare that we could sort of imagine, a patient comes into to see a doctor, has like something like jaundice-like symptoms. The doctor recognizes that and orders tests which are likely to indicate something like jaundice. And so we don't necessarily have in our covariates that we're looking at a column that says like patient came in looking like they had jaundice or something like that, or whatever disease. We're just only going to now observe potentially extra tests that were run because the doctor expected something to be indicated on those tests. So this is one example of a way in which missingness might actually depend on things that are unobserved. You could imagine that this could also be related to different like unobserved patient characteristics, where certain patient characteristics, maybe certain types of tests are more or less salient in the healthcare context, and they're more likely to be given in ways that are not fully captured by the kinds of demographic information that we have. So this kind of missingness is fairly common, or likely to be common in healthcare data. It's also the most complicated form. What can we do if we were to have missing not at random shift between the two data? Because we might expect that to be different if we have different patient characteristics across hospital networks. We might have different sort of policies that are applied in different ways, which might all depend on information that we don't observe. So how can we sort of handle this case? And it turns out the same kind of trick does not directly work. And the reason why it doesn't work is that because missing not at randomness ends up implying even though the conditional outcome distributions on the counterfactual data are the same, when on the data that we observed, the missing not at randomness part sort of introduces a type of selection, which means that the observed conditional outcomes are not the same. And so we can't just reweight the source data, because now the conditional outcome is different. And to give you a graph representation of like why that might not work is, now we're in this case where we're not on the same line anymore. And so yeah, we can reweight our data, we could reweight those points in the source that are sort of closer to the target. But because we're on different lines, there's no guarantee that we're getting closer to the approximation that we want. We could, in principle, be getting even farther away. So that's a huge bummer. We expect, as we've kind of, the argument we're sort of making is EHR data is likely to have lots of missingness. It's likely to be different across things like hospital networks. We might expect that missingness to be missing not at random. So how do we handle this case if we're sort of in we're sort of in this situation where the usual approach might not guarantee that we get any closer to the truth. So the theorem that we sort of have developed basically says that there's some hope. And basically, if as long as we're willing to assume that the conditional outcome is continuous in some sense, and we have an imputation device that is good in the sense that the error is not too large, our domain adaptation error is going to be a function of that imputation error. And so the implications of this are basically like, if we're able to impute missing not at random data well, we can still do the we can still kind of use similar ideas to reweighting and with a slightly modified recipe. And so what does that recipe look like? Now we have to sort of impute missing data on both the target and source separately. Now we're going to have to impute these slightly more complicated weights, which you'll notice are not a function of the observed data or the counterfactual data, but rather the imputed data. And then we can use this reweighted data to sort of estimate the target outcome that we care about. And so that might sound great if you haven't worked with missing data before, but if you have, you're probably saying, oh great, all we have to do is impute missing not at random data, like good luck. And there's truth to that. So what is the traditional approach that we use to do missing not at random? Well, the kind of traditional like earliest approach is basically we're going to specify some kind of a parametric model, which models both the stuff that we observed and the stuff that we don't. And if we get that right, then maybe we can impute that data. But if we sort of think back to the original ICU data that we were talking about, we had something like 57 covariates. And those covariates are complicated. It seems unlikely that we are going to be able to believably write down parametric models that we believe for all 57 of those covariates. And that's a trimmed list of covariates. In some contexts in EHR, you might have even more variables and the relationships might be quite complicated. So it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to rely on sort of domain knowledge to write down really good parametric models that describe the missingness. And that's before we get into the task at hand, which is really prediction. It's also really unlikely that people working on this kind of data are going to have the time to be able to do that sort of thing. So what do we do? And largely what I want to kind of talk about is two emerging literatures that we're going to try to take advantage of. And in particular, in today, I want to talk a little bit about this machine learning approach. But there's two literatures right now that are really trying to work on how do we identify missing not at random structures without making really strong parametric assumptions. And the first one I sort of teased on the left, which is this sort of MDEG approach. Razia Nabi, for example, her lab have been working a lot on this. How can we kind of use these missing DAG structures and basically get results that tell us which types of problems we're able to identify non-parametrically. And so those results sort of tell us, like, in certain contexts, we're able to non-parametrically recover the missing not at random distribution. Then you can sort of use your favorite flexible approach in order to estimate the missing not at randomness. And those are great. The one problem is that they've shown their results are maybe too good. They've shown that the self-censoring mechanism, which we discussed, is not actually identifiable non-parametrically. And we sort of mentioned that Self-censoring seems like the kind of thing that might be common in healthcare situations. So we won't be able to rely exclusively on this approach. There's also not that much applications in terms of applying these MDAG stuff in practice at this point, but it's a promising approach. The same lab has been working on sort of slightly sort of extensions, which make sort of semi-parametric restrictions and allow us to recover more stuff, which I think is quite promising. And that work looks a lot in flavor. It looks a lot like this machine learning approach. And so there's a machine learning approach that's been developed in recent years, which is trying to take advantage of variational autoencoders in deep learning to sort of have more flexible models of missingness. And so the first version of this was developed for missing at random data. But if you're familiar with sort of machine learning approaches, the basic structure kind of goes is that we're going to have these potentially very complicated neural net models for the marginal covariates and this QZ given XO distribution. And we can kind of think of that as like a latent space generating model. And if we're able to sort of flexibly estimate that Q, we're going to be able to generate new observations. And people have extended this in several ways to try to look at missing not at random structures. So this not me way in particular and GINA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those models look like. So I just got to move my screen again. So this is a sort of structure, a sort of a probabilistic model for the kinds of structures that these models were developed for. So if we look at the graph on the left, we have sort of these 4 different columns of variables. The first one is Z. These are these sort of latent variables, which are largely generating the correlations between our covariates, which we're labeling X1, X2, and X3. And those things are allowed to be related effectively arbitrarily to all of the different missingness indicators, R1, R2, and R3. And like before, we're sort of representing these X1 star, X2 star, X3 star to be our observed data. And so not MeWay is sort of set up for this kind of a probabilistic graph. And GINA in particular sort of extends it to allowing additional relationships between the covariates. So X1 can cause X2 directly, not necessarily through the latent structure, for example. And so this is kind of interesting. In principle, if we have structures that belong to these classes, we should be able to use these variational autoencoders to flexibly flexibly model the unobserved structure and recover and get some sort of an imputation device which can help us in our domain adaptation problem without having to make super strict parametric assumptions. And GINA in particular is notable in that they did a lot of really impressive work to actually show that these variational autoencoders are identifiable. So what do we mean by identifiable? Obviously, a neural net in terms of parameters is not going to be identifiable. It's way too flexible, but identifiable with respect to the missingness distributions directly. And so that's also very interesting coming from the more traditional statistics version. There's a new literature in variational autoencoders, which are trying to think about the conditions under which these kinds of models might be identifiable. And GINA is built sort of using so-called identifiable variation autoencoders. So in theory, anything that belongs to this kind of a graph on the right is not just the model is not just probabilistically structured that way, but rather in theoretically shown to be recoverable. And there are still parametric assumptions, like I kind of said earlier. We can show non-parametrically that things like self-censoring are not actually identifiable, but those parametric restrictions are quite weak. They look a lot like the sort of semi-parametric assumptions you might be used to in that literature. Okay, so that's all great. So there's a couple different literatures that are thinking about how can we more flexibly recover missing out at random data. That might be very important in this healthcare context because um, we don't know if we can write down plausible parametric models for the amount of missing data that we have. But like, do they actually work? And this is obviously a hard question to answer. So a lot of the kind of stuff we've been focusing on is like, how do we develop a simulation framework that's going to like slowly allow us to sort of think through context where these new machine learning models are going to help us and where they might not, because there is a lot of information and a lot of tools that are developed in the traditional statistics literature for dealing with different types of missingness, and we don't want to just assume that the machine learning approach is better because it's fancier in some sense. So this is our kind of what we call like our simplest case of a simulation. It's not that simple, but depending on how you think about it, it really is. So we're going to kind of use that structure that we've talked about. We're going to have these latent variables Z, which are going to generate different correlations between the um, different covariates. We're going to generate all three of the covariates as a function of those latent variables. That's going to determine the missingness structures, which have arbitrary relations between the different covariates, and allow us to sort of simulate missing not at random structures where the missingness will depend on the variables that we don't actually observe. And that's going to generate what we actually do observe.
Tyrel, can I just interrupt for a second? So I got a question from Pat. He sent me the question, do the machine learning algorithms depend on the training data?
Um, I guess in what, I mean, yes, but I guess do they mean in yeah, I'm not sure in what sense that's meant. Like, yeah, I think in any model is going to depend on the training data that we have, but is there something more specific than that?
So let me, this is Pat. So I've only studied machine learning superficially. I took a 1 day, or actually a 1 week workshop, and we spent some time on algorithms that used were trained on some signal. So for example, I could imagine you having some kind of hypothesized missingness structure that would generate a pattern that would be trained, that would be used for training the machine learning. And then there was another class of models, and I don't remember exactly what they were, that were really much more exploratory, coming up with a whole set of distributions of outcomes. And anyway, some of us, well, I don't know if I'm the only one that doesn't know all this stuff about machine learning, but if you could just enlighten us a little bit about the flavors of the algorithms and how they end up dealing with recovering the information that's missing. Thank you.
Yeah. How should I say it? I mean, my like perspective on this kind of stuff probably comes maybe more from the traditional statistic side of things. So one of the things that I would kind of say, and this is a fairly general result. I sort of like mentioned this robust statistics literature, and I think this is like a really useful way to actually think about models generally, and you can kind of think about most machine learning models as sort of very flexible parametric or like bordering on semi-parametric models. And so in general, the results that we get, unless we're able to write down the true model, will almost always be determined by will almost always be a function of the covariate distributions that we happen to get. And so that's kind of seen in this kind of graph where our approximation, which is just these simple like lines in this case, like depend on where in the covariate space we are, because anytime we get the true model wrong, it's not going to be invariant. And I think this has implications to all kinds of machine learning models, but that does sort of tell us that, yeah, unless we're sure that we're right, whatever we estimate, whether it's a machine learning model or not, is going to depend on the training data. And that's part of why, I guess, in our sort of in our recipe, we're going to do this imputation sort of separately. And so in order to get the missingness in the target, we're going to just use the target data. In order to get the imputation in the source, we're just going to use the source data. But there's also probably other more complicated ways that things might depend. So one of the important considerations for a machine learning model is always going to be there's a lot of hyperparameters in a lot of cases. You might have a lot of these little choices that you're going to have to make. And those things generally do have quite large impacts on the quality of the results. I think something that we haven't solved by any means, and something we need to think about more carefully in this particular context, is how are we going to be able to, how should we think about the hyperparameter problem in this context, where our baseline assumption, if I go, where was it? Here is that in the target, we might not have that many samples. And so that might beg the question, how ought we determine hyperparameters, which sometimes exist in a very large space, if we don't necessarily have enough data in the target in and of itself to be able to estimate those effectively. Usually you're going to do that by something like cross-validation, for example. And I think that's a good question. There's a lot of different literatures that are dealing with these kinds of approaches. There's things that people do called like fine tuning, for example, where you can imagine a model that is many like layers deep of complexity. And what you're really doing is you share the base structure between different types of data sets, and then you allow the last little bit of it to be different and be influenced heavily by like a new set of training data. So maybe those are things that we can look at. Right now, we're sort of abstracting from that problem, but I think in practice, that's like a really useful consideration, that things are always going to sort of depend on the actual data that we have. Having few samples and having samples that are not representative is likely to make things more complicated. And because machine learning models are more complicated, the way in which the model depends on that training data may be less clear. And I think that can be a good argument for trying to use more simpler approaches. Like what's the like the main way that people in practice deal with missing not at random data? Well, you take a simple model that's meant for missing at random data, and you just see what happens. So like there's I think there's a good argument for trying simple statistical models in a lot of contexts because of those kinds of issues. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, you basically told me it's more complicated. I didn't mean to derail your presentation. We can talk about more at the end, but
no problem. Yeah. So this is kind of what our simulation framework looks like. We have these sort of 4 layers of things that we're generating. And what we want to be able to do is one kind of principle for simulations that I like is we want to be able to simulate stuff that sort of matches the assumptions of our models, but we also want to be able to simulate what happens if our simulations are even more complicated, for example, than the model assumptions, and how do different algorithms like behave in those settings. We're certainly not done exploring that, but I think this is our general framework. And the way that we're doing that is we're having, you'll notice in the generating equations, there's like F subscript Z, F subscript X, G subscript X, H X. These are all, we sort of built a framework that's going to allow us to use really complicated, like basically neural net type structures to posit those relationships. So that can allow us to make the relationship between the covariates like super nonlinear, or the relationship between the covariates and the missingness super nonlinear, or the relationship between the outcome and the covariates nonlinear. But also a lot of the big assumptions for the particular machine learning models also depend on the dependent structures. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about the ways we've sort of extended the dependent structures to be outside of the model assumptions. But in general, we want to sort of be able to evaluate 3 different types of imputation stuff. So I talked a little bit about machine learning. We're going to also do some what we're going to call joint Bayesian models, which are basically just going to be joint models for the equations that you see there, as well as a bunch of traditional approaches, things like mice. And mice isn't even one thing. Mice has the mice package has all kinds of ways that you can impute data, and we're going to try a lot of them. And so what do I mean by these joint Bayesian models? How am I for time? I wanted to make sure I'm not, I feel like maybe I'm talking a lot.
It's 10:54,
10:54.
and we'll go until 11.
Okay, I'll speed then. So we have these joint Bayesian models, which basically are just writing down parametric models across these structural equations. And like I said, we also want to play around with the dependent structures. So the top 2 are the graphical models that correspond to the 2 machine learning approaches I talked about. But also the bottom 2 are sort of extensions that they aren't directly made for, where we allow additional causation between the missingness mechanisms themselves, which is something that's a little bit hard to think about in practice how that might happen. But you can imagine really complicated causal structures, as well as having both causal structures between the covariates and the missingness themselves. And so we want to like vary a bunch of different stuff. So like the 3 most important things that I'm going to talk about right now, although we've done more simulations since, is how nonlinear is the relationship between the variables themselves. So we started from linear, so just having a simple linear model, which like something like mice is going to do really, really well, and to something like a neural net with 4 layers with 4 nodes each, for example. We want to vary how much missingness is there. So is there a little bit of missingness? Is there a lot of missingness? And then how much data we have, because we're only working with like 3 variables. 1 is assumed to be fully observed and 2 are not. We kept these numbers relatively small, from 500 to 2000, and then how much data do we have in the target relative to the source. So in total, we have something like 4,000 runs from what I'm showing you now. We have more now, but I haven't been able to make all the graphs. And this is what we're going to call like sort of the marginal approach. And this is just talking about the imputation error. And there's a couple things to note. Some of the joint Bayesian models do really, really well. We think this has to do with like, it's quite important to be able to capture the dependent structures between different things. But those 2 joint models that are doing the best, they sort of cheat in that I sort of mentioned one of our assumptions is that we don't necessarily have information about the outcome in the target. These 2 variables are actually using information from the target to help make the imputations. But that does tell us that this might be something, a route that's worth exploring. In some cases, will also have some samples, maybe not a lot, but we might also have some samples from the target. If our models are reasonably good and that we capture the right dependent structures, additionally specifying that outcome model is really helpful. And this might give us some avenues of how might we adapt the machine learning models more specifically to the domain adaptation case. And you can imagine sort of extending them to simultaneously modeling the outcome distribution. And that might actually help us quite a lot in certain cases, especially if we're willing to get some samples from the target outcome. In general, in terms of imputing, a lot of the mice models work really well. It's really hard to beat mice, even though, and all of the best mice models were developed under the assumption of missing at random. There is one which is called the random indicator approach that we use, which is able to handle a simple form of missing not at randomness. In general, that wasn't performing as well as just the more simple ones, but this does tell us it is pretty hard to beat mice. The machine learning models don't necessarily do amazing overall, but it's possible that we did not push the simulations enough to tell that. So one example is, like I mentioned, we varied how much nonlinearity there is On the left, this is when you allow the relationship between the covariates to be completely linear. And this is the case where the mice models really kill. Even though they're not necessarily getting the right missingness structure, they are able to model the observed variables really well, and that seems to dominate. The machine learning approaches don't do particularly well. On the right, we have our most nonlinear case, and you'll notice that the graph is basically shrunk. And it's not just that the mice models get worse, but it's also that the machine learning models were getting better. And this is really only one type of nonlinearity. Like I kind of mentioned in our in the simulations, there's a lot of ways to vary the nonlinearity. And so we're exploring even more complicated settings to see. We're not interested in just saying, oh, like this model is best, but we want to try to get a sense of like, what are the kinds of scenarios when different approaches are likely to do better? And it's not really likely to be a one size fits all type situation, but trying to get a little bit more nuance into when different models perform well. This kind of shows the different, I don't know if I have time to talk about it. This shows like the simulations in the different DAGs. The causal structure really matters. And this is something we need to dive more into, even though the general principles tend to hold and the same kinds of models tend to be grouped together. The way in which the variables cause each other, in particular, adding like causal structures between the missingness themselves, really does change the sort of flavor and how easy it is to recover these types of models. So I think I probably don't have time. We did a little bit of this on the EICU data. It doesn't necessarily do well, probably because the conditional outcome distributions are likely to be different, which was one of our underlying assumptions. And then also, as I showed you, there just might not be enough overlap. So this is something we're trying to think about from the causal perspective. Is overlap is something we talk a lot about. What does that sort of mean in this context? Can we use some of those ideas to help do better in those contexts? So I think I'll just stop it there before I get cut off. But if there's any other questions, happy to answer them.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Tyrel. So I'm going to clap on behalf of everybody for this super interesting talk. We are at time, and so probably if folks have follow-up questions, it might be best to connect with Tyrel offline. You're here at NYU, right? So that's also great. But yeah, thank you again so much, and I'll clap again. And for folks, we have another. I forget exactly when our next seminar is, but we have a great lineup of seminars this semester. So hope to see some of you there in the near future. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us, and hope you have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.